The morning Walter Bergstrom drove past the stranded Peterbilt on County Road 14. He was 71 years old, and his hands hurt the way old hands hurt in October. Not bad enough to stop him. Just bad enough to remind him every time he gripped the steering wheel of his pickup that the body keeps a record, even when the mind tries to forget. He had been up since 4:30. He had been up since 4:30 every morning for 49 years, since the summer of 1938, when he had married Eleanor and moved her into the small white farmhouse that Henrik had built in 1912. The hour did not require an alarm. The body knew the hour. The way the body knew the way to the kitchen in the dark. He had eaten 2 eggs and a piece of toast at 5, drunk 2 cups of coffee, read 4 pages of the Hardin County Independent, walked out to the barn at 6:15 to feed the 4 heifers he kept for beef and the dozen laying hens Eleanor had ordered from a hatchery in Iowa Falls in 1972 and had been replacing piecemeal ever since. By 7, he had been on the road in his pickup, heading toward the Eldora cooperative for grease fittings and gear oil and a roll of half-inch heater hose. That was when he saw the truck. He saw it from a quarter-mile out, saw the angle of it, saw the way the trailer sat at 12 degrees off level, with the rear tandems buried into Iowa clay, so deep the axle housings disappeared. Saw the wrecker working the pull and the cable going taut, and the smoke rising from the asphalt where the rubber met the road. Saw the way the truck did not move. Walter slowed his pickup to 25 and looked. Did not stop. Did not roll down the window. Did not honk or wave. Just looked. The way a man looks when he is recording something for later. He could see 2 men standing on the shoulder. One of them was the wrecker operator, big through the shoulders, working some kind of control panel on the side of the wrecker. The other was a younger man in a Carhartt jacket, standing back at the edge of the road with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders arranged in a way Walter recognized from 50 years of watching men stand next to problems they could not solve. Walter did not know either of them by name. He knew the trailer, though. Hollis Grain Hauling. He had seen those red cabs and black trailers on county roads for years. He drove past at 25 miles per hour. He did not look back in the rear-view mirror. The body had already recorded what it needed to record. By the time he reached the parts counter at the Eldora cooperative, 10 minutes after that, the image of the stuck truck was still working in him. Working the way pictures work when something about them does not add up. 47,000 pounds of soybeans by the look of the trailer. A Peterbilt 389, maybe 3 years old. The wrecker had been a Century 1150. 50 tons of rated capacity. Big enough that whoever was driving it knew his business, and the truck had not moved. Walter set his order on the counter. 6 grease fittings, 2 quarts of 90-weight gear, oil a roll of half-inch heater hose. The clerk behind the counter was a young man named Connor, who did not yet know what he did not know, and that was fine, because everyone starts that way. Walter paid in cash, counted the coins, slipped the receipt into the chest pocket of his barn coat. The barn coat that had been his father's once, and was not new even then. A canvas thing repaired in 3 places with baling twine, because Eleanor had stopped trying to convince him to buy a new one back in 1979. That was when he heard the man on the phone. The voice came from the far end of the counter. Younger man, maybe 38, wearing a Carhartt jacket that still had its original color and good leather boots that were not country boots. Boots from a department store. The man held the receiver against his ear and pressed 2 fingers into his temple. The way men do when the math in their head has stopped being math and started being something else, I understand the man was saying. I do, but you have to understand my position. I am losing $2,400 a day in penalties just on your contract alone. And I have got 3 more elevators waiting on grain that is currently sitting in mud on County Road 14. A pause. The man closed his eyes briefly. The wrecker company says a week. They need to bring a crane in from Des Moines. That is what they are telling me. Another pause. Longer this time. Yes, I know. I know what that means. I am asking. That is all I'm doing. Asking. Walter watched without watching. The way a man learns to in 50 years of standing in feed stores and parts counters and equipment auctions. The man on the phone was going under. Walter could see it. The shoulders said one thing. The fingers on the temple said something else. The voice was holding steady the way a voice holds steady right before it cracks. The man hung up, set the receiver down with deliberate gentleness, stood there for a long moment looking at the countertop. Did not move. Walter knew the name then. Garrett Hollis. Hollis Grain Hauling out of Eldora. Started the company 11 years back with 1 borrowed truck. Walter had seen the trucks on the road for years. 7 of them now. Red cabs, black trailers, the name painted in yellow along the door panels. A man who had built something, who was watching it sit in mud on a Tuesday morning while the rain kept coming. Walter picked up his bag of fittings. It was none of his business. He turned to leave. Then he stopped. And here is the thing about Walter Bergstrom that not many people in Hardin County understood. The thing his father Henrik had taught him in 1934 when Walter was 18 years old and standing next to his father at a Depression auction, watching another family lose everything they had ever owned. Henrik had said it quiet enough that only Walter could hear. Someday, this might be us. And then Henrik had bought a 1928 Caterpillar 30 for $1,850. And then Henrik had said something else to his 18-year-old son. Something Walter had carried for 53 years. If you have a thing that can help, and you walk past someone who needs it, you do not own that thing. It owns you. Walter set the bag of fittings back on the counter. He walked the length of the parts counter to where Garrett Hollis was still standing, and he stood there until Garrett looked up. I heard your phone call, Walter said. Word travels at the co-op. Garrett's eyes registered him slowly, the way a man registers something that does not fit the situation. Walter watched him take in the barn coat and the faded John Deere cap, and the hands stained permanent with the grease of 50 years of work. Watched the polite expression assemble itself. Yes, sir, Garrett said. You have got a truck on 14. Garrett nodded. The polite expression did not change. Wrecker telling you a week. How did you hear that? Walter did not answer the question. He had no good answer. The truth was that he had heard half of one phone call and read the rest from the man's shoulders. Instead, he said something else. I might have something that could move it. Garrett's polite expression flickered. Something underneath came up to the surface for a half second and then went back down. Walter had seen the look 10,000 times across 7 decades. It was not contempt exactly. It was the look of a man trying not to be rude. "I appreciate that," Garrett said. "I really do. But I have got 47,000 pounds of beans in that trailer. The wrecker that came out has 50 tons of rated capacity, and it could not move it. I do not think." "What have you got?" Walter asked. "The wrecker. A Century 1150. Walter nodded. "Hooked it to the trailer hitch." Garrett blinked. "Yeah, I think so. That is why it did not move," Walter said. Garrett opened his mouth, closed it. Walter took a slow breath, felt the arthritis in his right shoulder pull when he did it. He had lived with that pull for 3 years now. Was still getting used to the small ways the body said no. "You do not need horsepower," Walter said. "You need pull. There is a difference." Garrett looked at him then. Really looked. Walter could see him cataloging. The barn coat, the cap, the hands, the age. The unmistakable fact that this man standing in front of him was the exact opposite of what modern problem-solving looked like in 1987. "What kind of equipment?" Garrett asked. "Caterpillar 30. Built in 1928. The pause that followed was the longest pause of Walter's afternoon. He could see Garrett doing math behind his eyes. Could see him trying to find a polite way to say no. Walter helped him out. "You will have to make your own decision about it," Walter said. "I will be home tonight if you want to talk. Bergstrom place out on County Road 8. There is a mailbox." He picked up his bag of fittings. He walked out of the cooperative. He did not look back. Outside, the rain had stopped briefly. The sky was the color of wet wool. Walter sat in his pickup with the engine off for a full minute before he turned the key. He did not know why he had stopped. Did not know why he had spoken. Henrik had been dead for 31 years, and Walter could still hear his father's voice as clearly as if Henrik were sitting in the passenger seat. "If you walk past someone who needs it, you do not own that thing." Walter started the truck. Drove home through the rain that had started again. 22 miles to the farm. The Bergstrom farm sat on 320 acres. In the northeast corner of Hardin County ground that Henrik had broken in 1909, and Walter had farmed every year since 1941. The same furrows, the same fence lines, the same hill on the south end where the soybean ground gave way to the hayfield, and below that, the creek bottom where the cottonwoods grew, and the deer came down at dusk. He parked the pickup by the machine shed, sat there a second time, looked at the shed. The Caterpillar was inside. 59 years old, in 1987. A 1928 model that Henrik had bought second-hand at the Depression auction and driven home 22 miles on its own steel tracks because they could not afford a trailer. A machine that had been 6 years old when Henrik bought it and had hard use on it then. A machine that Henrik had maintained for 27 years before passing it to Walter in 1961. A machine that Walter had maintained for 26 more years after that. A machine Walter had not used for a serious pull since 1978. 9 years. Walter sat in the pickup looking at the closed door of the machine shed and felt something he had not felt in a long time and did not particularly want to feel. Doubt. The kind of doubt that is not loud. the kind that just sits in your chest and waits to see what you are going to do about it. He thought about the angle of the truck on County Road 14. He thought about 47,000 pounds of beans and 300 pounds per square inch of suction wrapped around the side walls of those tandems. He thought about the strength of his own hands on a winter morning when he tried to button his shirt. He thought about Henrik's hands at the end. The way Henrik had set down the wrench in 1961 and looked at his hands and said simply, Walter got out of the pickup, walked into the house through the side door. Eleanor was in the kitchen with her back to him. She heard the door and did not turn. "You want coffee?" she said. "Yes." She poured, set the cup on the table, sat down across from him. 49 years married this December. She knew the shape of his silences the way she knew the shape of her own hand. "There was a truck stuck on 14 this morning," Walter said. She waited, a Peterbilt, with 47,000 pounds in the trailer. The wrecker could not move it. She waited. "The owner is a fellow named Hollis. Garrett Hollis. He is looking at $30,000 in losses by the time the crane comes in from Des Moines." She waited. I told him I could move it. Eleanor did not say anything for a long moment. Then she lifted her own cup and took a slow sip and set the cup down in exactly the same place it had been. "With the cat. With the cat." She nodded, looked out the window at the rain coming down on the yard. The same window she had looked out of for 49 years. The same yard. "When did you last use it for a pull like that?" 78. That is a while. That is a while. Eleanor turned her face back to him then. Walter could see the lines around her eyes that had been there for 30 years, and the new lines that had come in the last 5. She had aged the way good wood ages, slowly, becoming more itself. "Walter," she said. "Yeah, your father did not give you that machine to keep clean in a shed." The words landed. He did not answer right away because there was no answer to give. The words were not asking him for anything. They were just placing something on the table between them. The way Eleanor had placed his coffee. The way Eleanor had placed every important thing in their 49 years. "I know," he said. She nodded once, got up, went to the sink, began washing the breakfast dishes she had been about to wash when he had come through the door. The sound of the water running was the sound that had been in their kitchen for half a century and would be there for whatever was left. Walter sat at the table and drank his coffee. He thought about his father. He thought about Henrik Bergstrom, born in 1884, said in 1956. A man who had come from Norway as a child with his parents in 1891 and had grown up speaking Norwegian at home and English at school, and had never quite lost the slight shape of the old country in his vowels. A man who had broken 320 acres of Hardin County prairie with a team of horses in 1909 and had never owned a piece of equipment in his life that he did not understand, down to the last bolt. Walter thought about the auction. He could remember it in pieces. 18 years old. The fall of 1934. The Donovan family. Walter could not remember the parents' first names anymore, but he could still see the mother's face. He could still see the way she had stood with her hands folded and her chin lifted and her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance while her family's life was sold off in lots. The grain wagons, the walking plow, the team of bay mares, the household furniture. And finally, the Caterpillar 30 that the father had bought new in 1928, when the farm had been good, and the prices had been good, and the future had been the kind of future a man can lean into. Henrik had not bid on much that day. He had stood at the back of the small crowd, with his hands in the pockets of his coat. Walter had stood next to him. The auctioneer had worked through the household goods and the smaller equipment and the team. And then they had brought out the Caterpillar. Bidding had started at $3,000. There had been no bid. $2,500. No bid. $2,000. No bid. $1,500. Henrik had raised his hand. A mo Walter did not recognize had raised his against the back wall. $1,600 from Henrik. $1,700 from the back wall. $1,800 from Henrik. The man at the back wall had hesitated. The auctioneer had looked at him. The man had shaken his head. The auctioneer had looked back at Henrik. $1,800 going once. $1,800 going twice. $1,850, if you will take it, sir. Henrik had nodded. $1,850 sold. Walter had watched his father walk to the front and pay in cash. $1,850 in 20s and 10s and a few singles, counted out slowly on the auctioneer's clipboard. Walter had watched the Donovan father standing next to the auctioneer, with his hands folded the same way his wife was holding hers. When the money was paid, Henrik had walked over to the man. "I am sorry," Henrik had said. The Donovan man had nodded once, had said nothing, had walked away. That was when Henrik had said the thing to his 18-year-old son, quiet enough that no one else could hear. Walter had to bend a little to catch it. Someday, this might be us. So we take care of what comes to us. We do not waste it. And if we ever have a thing that can help someone who is where the Donovans are right now, we use it. That is the price of having it. Walter had been 18 years old. He had nodded the way an 18-year-old nods when his father says something serious. He had not understood. Not really. He had understood it slowly. Over the next 53 years. Henrik had driven the Caterpillar home that day. 22 miles on its steel tracks at 4 miles an hour because they had no trailer. Walter had followed in the Model T. The two of them had arrived at the farm at sundown. Eleanor had not been Eleanor yet. She had been a girl Walter had not yet met. The future had been the kind of long open thing that an 18-year-old does not have any framework for. That night, Henrik and Walter had backed the Caterpillar into the machine shed. Henrik had walked around it with a flashlight, had pointed at things Walter could not see. The track adjustment, the grease fitting on the third roller, the way the steering clutch was set just slightly soft. Henrik had said, "I will teach you. We will keep this machine running until one of us is dead. And then you will keep it running until you are dead. And then your son will. And by the time we are all done with it, they will have to bury it because nothing else will stop it." Walter had laughed. Henrik had not. Walter sat at the kitchen table with his cold coffee and looked out the window at the rain coming down on the yard he had shared with Eleanor for 49 years, and felt the words his father had said in 1934 sitting in his chest like something solid. If you walk past someone who needs it, you do not own that thing. He got up, took his coffee cup to the sink. Eleanor was drying the breakfast dishes now. He set the cup in the wash water without looking at her. She did not look at him either. They had stopped needing to look at each other for the small things a long time ago. "I am going to call him Walter," said. "I figured you would." He went to the wall phone in the hallway. The Hollis Grain Hauling number was in the phone book on the small table beneath the phone in the section for Eldora businesses between Hartfield Implement and Howard Lumber. Walter found it. Dialed. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered. "Hollis residence. This is Walter Bergstrom calling. Is Garrett there?" "He is in the office. I can give you that number." Walter wrote the office number on the back of the phone book with the pencil he kept on the table. Hung up. Dialed again. Garrett picked up on the second ring. "Hollis, this is Walter Bergstrom. From the co-op this morning." "Yes, sir. I would like to come look at your truck in the morning if you would like the help. 7 o'clock. I will bring the cat and my son, Wendell." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Walter could hear Garrett breathing, could hear an office in the background. Someone else was talking on another phone, a radio playing low. "Mr. Bergstrom, yes, I want to be straight with you. I am not sure that what you are proposing is going to work. I have a wrecker man named Roland Delaney who has 50 tons of equipment, and he has already failed twice. I am waiting on a crane out of Des Moines that is going to cost me $4,000 a day for 3 days. I have a contractor named Brett Holloway from Holloway Heavy Recovery driving up tomorrow morning to set the crane up. He will be there at 7:30. Then we will be there at 7, Walter said. Garrett did not say anything for a moment. "I am not asking you to pay me," Walter said. "I am asking you to let me try. If it works, you save $30,000. If it does not work, you have lost an hour. Mr. Holloway can set up his crane after I have cleared out." Another pause. "Mr. Bergstrom, may I ask you a question?" "Yes." "Why are you doing this?" Walter looked at the phone in his hand. Looked at the wall above the phone, where Eleanor had hung a framed photograph of the original Bergstrom homestead in 1910. The sod house. Henrik standing next to the front door, 26 years old, wearing a hat too big for his head. Walter's grandfather sitting on a wooden chair Henrik had brought outside for the picture. 3 women on the porch. Walter's mother had not been born yet. "I had a father," Walter said, "who taught me that if you have a thing that can help someone who needs it, you use that thing. Otherwise, you are just keeping it. And keeping a thing is not the same as owning it." The line was quiet for several seconds. 7 o'clock, Garrett said finally. 7 o'clock. Walter hung up the phone. He walked back into the kitchen. Eleanor was sitting at the table again. She had poured herself a fresh cup of coffee. She looked up when he came in. "He is going to let you try. He is going to let me try." She nodded slowly, took a sip of her coffee. "Walter," she said. "Yeah, you have not done a pull like this since '78. "I know. Your hands are not what they were in '78. "I know." She did not say anything else. She did not need to. They sat across from each other in the kitchen at the table where they had eaten 49 years of meals, and Walter felt the weight of what he had just agreed to settling into him slowly the way water settles into clay. He had told the man he would bring the cat. He had told the man he could help. He had told the man that the machine his father had bought for $1,850 in 1934 would do what 50 tons of modern equipment could not do, and he was not entirely sure it would. That was the truth he had been carrying since the moment he had spoken to Garrett Hollis at the parts counter. The truth he had not let himself look at directly. The truth that was sitting in him now like a stone in his chest as he sat across from his wife of 49 years. He did not know if he could still do it. The cat could do it. The cat had always been able to do it. The cat was a machine, and machines did what they were built to do as long as someone maintained them properly. And Walter had maintained the cat properly for 26 years, and his father had maintained it properly for 27 years. Before that, the cat was not the question, he was the question. 71 years old, hands that hurt in the morning, a back that did not bend the way it had bent in 78, eyes that did not see distance the way they had seen it in 68, a judgment that he hoped was still as good as it had been at 55. He thought about Henrik in 1961, the day Henrik had set down the wrench and said simply Henrik had been 77, 6 years older than Walter was now, and Henrik had known the day was coming because his hands had been shaking too badly for 3 months to safely thread a half-inch bolt. Henrik had walked Walter out to the machine shed, had handed Walter the keys to a toolbox he had been carrying the keys to since 1921, had said, "You take care of it now," and Walter had taken care of it. But there was a difference between taking care of something and using it, and Walter had spent the last 9 years taking care of the cat without using it for what the cat was built to do. He had run it on the farm, pulled tree stumps, moved hay wagons in the spring mud. Light work, the kind of work the cat could do half asleep. He had not asked the cat to pull 47,000 pounds out of suction clay since the grain bin in 78, and he had not been certain the cat could do it then, and he was not certain the cat could do it now. Or rather, he was not certain that he could rig it to do it, because that was the thing about a pull like this. It was not horsepower. He had told Garrett that. It was pull. And pull was not just a function of the machine. It was a function of geometry and chain selection and crib placement and the angle the cable came off the load and the moment when the operator decided to engage the clutch. It was a function of judgment, of attention, of paying attention to 10,000 small things at once and getting every one of them right. If he got one of them wrong, the chain would break, or the truck would shift sideways, or the cat itself would come up off its tracks, or a man would die. Wendell would be standing on the field. Roland Delaney and his crew would be standing on the field. Brett Holloway would be standing on the field with whatever crew he brought up from Des Moines. Garrett Hollis would be standing on the field. If anything went wrong, the wrong thing might go through one of them. Walter set his coffee cup down. Eleanor was watching him. "You are scared," she said. It was not a question. A little. She nodded, reached across the table, put her hand over his. Her hand was the same hand that had taken his at the front of First Lutheran Church in 1938, when she was 19 and he was 22, and the world had been in front of them like an open road. The hand was older now, the skin thinner, the veins more visible, but it was the same hand. "Your father trusted you with that machine," she said. "I know. You have trusted yourself with it for 26 years. I know. And you have taken care of it the way he taught you. I have. Then it will do what you need it to do tomorrow morning." Walter looked at his wife, the woman he had married in 1938. the woman who had stood next to him through every hard thing they had ever been through the loss of their first baby in 1941, through the $7,000 drought debt of 1954, through Henrik's death in 1956, through Wendell's pneumonia in the winter of 1948, when the doctor had told them to be ready, through every January when the bills came in faster than the milk checks went out, through every August when the wind came in, dry and brown across the bean fields, through 49 years of small mornings and small evenings that had added up somehow to a life. She had never once asked him to be smaller than what his father had asked him to be. He turned his hand over under hers and squeezed. "Thank you," he said. She did not say anything, just sat with her hand over his at the kitchen table while the rain came down on the yard and the light got grayer and the day got later. After supper, Walter went out to the machine shed alone. He turned on the single bulb that hung from the rafter above the workbench. The shed was 40 feet long and 24 wide, and Henrik had built it in 1927 with lumber milled from a stand of cottonwoods that had grown along the creek bottom. The roof had been replaced twice. The siding had been replaced once. But the frame was still Henrik's frame. The bench was still Henrik's bench. The vise that was bolted to the corner of the bench had been bolted there in 1927 and had never been moved. The caterpillar sat in the middle of the shed. Walter walked around it. Slowly, the way he had walked around it 10,000 times before. The track tension on the left side, the track tension on the right, the condition of the cleats, the grease at each fitting, the fluid in the radiator, the level on the engine oil, the fuel in the tank, the condition of the seat, the throttle linkage, the clutch travel, the brakes. Everything was as it had been the previous Saturday when he had done the weekly maintenance. He pulled the chain box down from the loft above the bench. 200 feet of 3/4-inch grade 70 alloy chain coiled inside. 2 snatch blocks, 4 shackles graded for 30,000 pounds, a pair of toe plates, a roll of baling wire that Henrik had bought in 1947 and Walter had never finished using. He laid the chain out on the concrete floor of the shed, all 200 feet of it. He started at one end. He ran his fingers along each link. He felt for stress fractures. He felt for elongation. He felt for the small, smooth wear pattern that meant a link was beginning to fail. The chain was good. He had known it would be. But knowing and checking were different things, and Henrik had taught him the difference in 1944 when Walter had been 28 years old and had skipped a chain check before a pull and had nearly killed his cousin Olaf when a link failed at 4,000 pounds of load. Olaf had been standing 6 feet from the chain when it broke. The flying section had passed 3 inches above his shoulder. Henrik had not yelled at Walter. Henrik had just said, "Never again." And Walter had never again. He coiled the chain when he was done. He set it on the workbench. He turned off the bulb. He stood in the dark shed for a minute. The rain had stopped outside. He could hear the drip of water off the eaves and the quiet ticking of the cooling engine block of the Caterpillar, still warm from the work he had done on it that afternoon. He could not see the machine, but he could feel it, the way a man feels the shape of his own hand, in the dark. Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. What would you have done in Walter's place? Would you have offered to help a stranger when your hands were old and your reputation was on the line, and the man in front of you looked at you like you were already finished? Or would you have walked out of that co-op and let someone else handle it? Drop a comment and let me know. Because what happened the next morning on County Road 14 is something this county is still talking about almost 40 years later. And it started with a 71-year-old man and a 59-year-old machine, and a question Walter Bergstrom would not stop asking himself for the rest of that long, quiet night. Whether the man he used to be was still inside the man he had become. Walter slept 4 hours that night. He had not slept 4 hours in one stretch since he was 35 years old, but he slept those 4 hours hard. The way a man sleeps when his body has decided that whatever question is waiting for him in the morning will still be there, whether he answers it now or at sunrise. He was up at 4:30, coffee at 4:40, out the side door at 5. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, and the yard was wet, but the sky was the color of pewter beginning to clear. He stood on the back step for a minute and looked east. There was a band of pale light along the horizon where the night was thinning. A red-winged blackbird called once from the cottonwoods down by the creek. He walked to the machine shed. He had laid out his tools on the workbench the night before. The grease gun, the spare links of 3/4-inch chain in case he needed to lengthen anywhere, the pair of leather gloves Eleanor had given him for his 65th birthday, the small notebook with the pencil tied to it that he kept in his coat pocket for writing down measurements, the thermos he had filled with coffee at 4:40. He started the Caterpillar at 5:15. The engine caught on the third rotation of the crank, the way it always caught. The exhaust came out the stack in a slow gray plume that hung in the cold air for a moment before it began to rise. Walter stood next to the machine for a long minute and listened. He listened for anything that did not belong. A skip in the firing, a bearing note from the front roller assembly, a change in the idle as the engine warmed. There was nothing. The cat sounded the way the cat had sounded for 59 years. The same low diesel rhythm that Henrik had listened to 10,000 mornings. The same small variations as the throttle came up to operating speed. The same patience. Wendell arrived at 5:45 with the flatbed. Walter's son was 41 years old that fall. A big man taller than his father by 3 inches, broader through the shoulders, slower in his movements the way men become slow when they have learned that hurry costs more than it saves. He had the same hands as Walter and the same hands as Henrik before that, wide across the palm with thick knuckles and the kind of nails that never quite came clean, no matter how long you scrubbed. Wendell did not say good morning. He did not need to. He pulled the flatbed up alongside the open shed door and got out and walked into the shed and stood next to his father and looked at the cat for a moment without speaking. Then he turned to Walter. "You ready?" Wendell said. "I am ready." Wendell nodded. They began loading. The chain went on the flatbed, first coiled and lashed, then the snatch blocks, then the timber cribbing. Walter had selected 8 pieces of oak cribbing the night before, each one 12 inches by 12 inches by 36 inches, each one weighing 190 pounds. Wendell loaded them by himself because he could, and because Walter had asked him to. Walter watched without offering to help because his shoulder would not have let him help anyway. and because Wendell had stopped letting his father lift heavy things 3 years before without needing to make a discussion of it. By 6:15, they were ready. Walter climbed onto the Caterpillar, settled into the seat. The seat had been replaced once in 1964. The leather was soft now, in the places where his weight had pressed for 26 years. He fitted his hands to the steering clutch levers. The levers had been worn smooth by Henrik's hands first, and then by his. He looked back at Wendell. Wendell was already in the cab of the pickup, pulling the flatbed. "I will meet you there," Walter said. Wendell nodded. Walter engaged the clutch. The Caterpillar moved out of the shed onto the gravel drive. 4 miles per hour. He turned south on County Road 8 and started toward the intersection with 14. The sun was coming up behind him. The light fell across the fields in the long, flat way it falls in October, when the corn is gone, and the soybeans are gone, and the ground is open all the way to the horizon. The sound of the steel tracks on the gravel road was a sound that had not been heard on County Road 8 in 9 years. The cleats made a steady ringing rhythm as they hit the surface and lifted and hit again. 14 inches wide, each one striking the road with the deliberate weight of cast iron. A sound like a slow bell being rung over and over by a hand that was not in any hurry to stop. Walter rode the cat, the 4 miles to the intersection at 4 miles per hour. It took him almost an hour. He passed 3 pickups going the other direction. Each driver looked at him for longer than they would have looked at a tractor. One of them was a man named Ralph Anderson, who had farmed 80 acres adjacent to the Bergstrom place since 1952. Ralph slowed his pickup, rolled down the window, looked at the cat, looked at Walter, did not ask. Just nodded once and rolled the window back up and drove on. By the time Walter reached County Road 14, the sun was full up. The Peterbilt was where it had been the morning before. Garrett Hollis was standing on the shoulder of the road with another man. Roland Delaney was there, with 2 of his crew. There was a third pickup parked behind Roland's wrecker that had not been there the day before. A new one. Bright red. Chrome wheels. The kind of pickup that costs more than most men in Hardin County earned in a year. A man in a tan canvas jacket was leaning against the front fender of that pickup with his arms crossed. Even from a quarter mile out, Walter could see the way the man stood. The angle of the shoulders, the set of the chin. Walter had seen that posture all his life and had learned what it meant before he turned 20. Wendell was already there. He had unloaded the flatbed, and the chain and the cribbing were laid out on the shoulder. Walter brought the cat to a stop 20 feet from the edge of the ditch. He shut down the engine. The silence that came after was sudden and total. He sat for a moment in the seat and let his eyes go over the situation. The truck, the angle of the trailer, the place where the rear tandems were buried, the condition of the road shoulder, the depth of the ruts that Roland's wrecker had cut the day before, the position of the new pickup with the chrome wheels. Then he climbed down. Garrett Hollis walked over to him. "Mr. Bergstrom," Garrett said. Walter nodded. Garrett gestured toward the man in the tan jacket. "This is Brett Holloway. He runs Holloway Heavy Recovery out of Des Moines. The crane is coming behind him. Should be here at 7:30. Brett Holloway pushed off the fender of his pickup and walked over with his hand extended. He was 35 years old. He had a square jaw and the kind of tan that comes from a tanning bed in October. He was wearing ostrich skin boots that had been polished within the last 48 hours and a Carhartt jacket that still had the manufacturer's crease at the cuffs. He smiled at Walter the way a man smiles when he has decided in advance how the conversation is going to go. "Mr. Bergstrom," Brett said. Walter shook his hand. The handshake was firm. Walter had expected that. "I understand you brought a tractor," Brett said. Walter nodded. Brett looked over at the Caterpillar. He let his eyes travel slowly across the machine. The faded gray paint, the grease stains on the side panels, the number stenciled on the front in letters that had been put there by Henrik in 1934 and had been touched up by Walter in 1967. The steel tracks with the worn cleats. Brett began to laugh. It was not a small laugh. It was loud enough that everyone on the shoulder of the road heard it. Roland Delaney heard it. Roland's 2 crew members heard it. Garrett Hollis heard it and looked at the ground. Wendell heard it, and his shoulders shifted slightly. And Walter saw it without turning his head. Old man Brett said, "That thing belongs in a museum. You drove that thing all the way out here. You actually drove it." Walter did not answer. Brett took 2 steps closer to the cat, stood with his hands on his hips, shook his head slowly. "I have not seen one of these in 20 years, he said. "My grandfather had one. He used it for skidding firewood out of the back lot. You know what we did with it when he died. We sold it for scrap. $850. Best thing we ever did with it." Walter said nothing. Brett turned back to him. "Look," he said. "I understand the sentiment. I do. But this is a 47,000-pound load buried in suction clay. I came up here from Des Moines this morning. I have a 50-ton crane coming behind me that costs my company $1,200 in mobilization fees alone. And you are going to embarrass yourself in front of all these people." The words landed in the cold morning air and stayed there for a long second. Walter looked at Brett Holloway. He did not look at him with anger. He did not look at him with any particular expression at all. He just looked at the man's face and let the moment sit. Brett held the look for about 4 seconds. Then his eyes shifted slightly. Not much, but enough that Walter saw it. "I understand," Walter said. He said nothing else. He turned away from Brett Holloway and walked toward the ditch. He walked the perimeter of the situation. Slowly, the way Henrik had taught him to walk a problem in 1937, the first time Walter had tried to figure out how to pull a hay wagon out of soft ground without losing the wagon or the team. "You walk it," Henrik had said. "You walk every side of it. You look at the load. You look at the ground. You look at what is above the load and what is below the load and what is on the far side of the load that you cannot see from where you are standing. And you do this until you know the shape of the problem in your head as well as you know the shape of your own hand." Walter walked. He walked the road shoulder where Roland's wrecker had failed twice. He walked the ditch bank on the far side. He walked behind the trailer and looked at the angle the rear tandems were buried at. He crouched down at one point and pressed his palm into the clay of the shoulder. The clay was tighter than it had been the morning before. The freezing temperature overnight had set the surface, but the deeper layer was still saturated. He could feel the difference through his palm. 3 minutes passed, then 4. Brett Holloway was watching him from the pickup with his arms crossed again. Roland Delaney was watching with the more careful expression of a man who knew the territory and was beginning to recognize that something was going on that he did not entirely understand. Walter straightened up, walked back to where Garrett and Brett and Roland were standing. "I am going to need to change your angle of pull," Walter said to Roland. "About 30 degrees off the line of the road." Roland nodded. Brett laughed again. Quieter this time, almost a snort. Walter turned to Wendell. "Get the chain laid out," he said. Wendell nodded and walked to the flatbed. Walter stood at the edge of the ditch and looked at the truck, while behind him the chain came off the flatbed. He was thinking about a cylinder of clay 40 inches in diameter, wrapped around each of the 4 tandem tires. 2,000 square inches of contact area on each tire side wall. 300 pounds per square inch of suction. 600,000 pounds of theoretical hold per tire. 2.4 million theoretical pounds of hold across all 4 tires. Of course, it was not really a 2.4 million pounds. The math did not work that simply. The clay was not uniform. There were air gaps. There were places where the seal had broken when the truck had shifted under Roland's first pull. The actual hold was somewhere between 50,000 and 120,000 pounds. Walter had been doing this math in his head for 50 years, and he could feel his way to the answer, the way another man feels his way to a familiar address. In the dark, the cat had a drawbar pull rating of 5,600 pounds at the engine. With the gear reduction in the final drive and the 14-inch steel cleats on saturated clay, the effective pull at the chain was approximately 22,000 pounds before the tracks broke loose. With the snatch block configuration he was about to rig, he could double that to 44,000. With the angle change and the lift component he was about to add, he could get another 15% of that into useful upward force. 60,000 pounds of effective working pull. It would be enough. He thought it would be enough. He was not completely certain. While Walter was doing this math, the year 1947 came up out of the ground in front of him. He had not asked for it. The mind does what the mind does. He could see Henrik bent over the lathe in the back corner of the machine shed, turning a replacement bushing for the steering clutch. The original bushing had failed in 1947 during the post-war shortage of parts. Caterpillar dealers across the Midwest were 3 months back ordered. Henrik had shrugged. Henrik had walked to the lathe. Henrik had taken a piece of bronze stock he had bought before the war and had turned a new bushing in 4 hours. The bushing was still in the cat. It had been in the cat for 40 years that fall. Then 1961 came up. Henrik in the doorway of the machine shed, hands shaking, setting the wrench down on the workbench, saying simply, "Time." Walter, 45 years of age. Walter going home to Eleanor that night and saying, "My father gave me the cat today." Eleanor had taken his hands in hers across the kitchen table and had not said anything for a long minute. Then she had said, "You have been ready for that for 27 years. Then, 1968. The Hartley family had a combine bind up in the middle of the bean field 2 miles south of the Bergstrom place during the worst rain September Hardin County had seen in 20 years. The combine had sunk to the axles. 3 other farmers had tried to pull it out with their tractors. Walter had brought the cat. 2 hours of rigging, a 40-minute pull. The combine had come out clean. Charlie Hartley had cried when it was over and had tried to give Walter $200, and Walter had refused. Then, 1972. the cattle van that had jackknifed on the ice on Highway 65 in February, with 34 steers in the trailer. 20 below zero. Walter and Wendell, who had been 26 that year, had worked the rigging for 90 minutes in the cold, while the steers bawled in the dark of the trailer. The pull had taken 30 minutes. 3 of the steers had died of exposure before they got the trailer upright. 31 had lived. Then, 1978. The Peterson grain bin. 12,000 bushels of corn. The bin had shifted off its concrete pad after a wet October had softened the ground beneath the foundation. The bin had been leaning at 13 degrees and rising. 3 engineers from Cedar Rapids had told Anders Peterson there was nothing to be done except to empty the bin 1 wagon at a time over 4 days, and hope. Walter had brought the cat. Walter had spent 6 hours studying the bin. Walter had rigged a system of cables and snatch blocks and counterweights that he had drawn out on the back of a feed bag with a carpenter's pencil. The pull had taken 2 hours and 11 minutes. The bin had come back to plumb without spilling a single bushel. Anders had not cried, but Anders had stood very still for a long time afterwards and had said simply, "Walter, I am in your debt." Walter had said, "You owe me nothing." Anders had said, "I know, 9 years." Walter looked up from the ditch. Wendell had the chain laid out along the shoulder. Walter walked to it, began the rigging. He worked slowly. He had always worked slowly. It was not because he was old. He had worked slowly when he was 45, and he had worked slowly when he was 60. Slow was the only speed at which a man could be sure he was doing it right. Slow was the speed at which Henrik had taught him. Slow was the speed at which his hands knew the work without his head having to think about it. The chain went from the front cross member of the trailer at a 40-degree angle to the first snatch block, which Wendell anchored to a railroad tie that they had brought up from the flatbed and driven into the shoulder of the road. From the snatch block, the chain ran at a corrected angle of 20 degrees to the second snatch block, which was anchored to the front of the caterpillar through a clevis pin in the original drawbar bracket that Henrik had welded on in 1935. From the second snatch block, the chain ran straight back to a heavy-duty hook that Walter would secure to the rear of the cat. Just before the pull, the geometry was specific. It was specific in a way that could not be explained without a pencil and paper. The 40-degree first angle distributed the suction load across the long axis of the trailer instead of pulling against the axles directly. The 20-degree second angle introduced a lift component that would help break the suction seal as the load began to shift. The straight return to the cat allowed Walter to use the full drawbar pull without lateral deflection that would have spun the tracks. It was not horsepower. It was geometry. It was the patient mathematics of leverage that Henrik had learned from a Norwegian engineer in 1896 and had taught to Walter in 1934. Walter checked the rigging twice, walked the entire path of the chain, looked at every angle, adjusted the second snatch block by 6 inches, walked the path again, did not adjust again. Then he crawled under the Peterbilt. He was 71 years old, and he crawled under a 47,000-pound trailer that was sitting on saturated clay with no support other than its own buried tandems, and his shoulder caught the wet ground 6 inches in, and his right knee popped audibly when he extended it. But he kept going. He needed to see the rear cross member. He needed to find the lift point. He needed to confirm with his own eyes and his own hands that the structural member he intended to hook to was still sound. It took him 11 minutes under the trailer. When he came out, his coat was solid black with clay from his shoulder to his hip. He stood up slowly. His knee popped again. He walked back to the flatbed without looking at anyone. Wendell handed him a rag. Walter wiped his hands, but not the coat. Brett Holloway watched all of this with his arms crossed. Roland Delaney watched it with a different expression. Garrett Hollis watched it leaning against the open door of his own pickup, and somewhere in the middle of the rigging, Garrett had stopped looking like a man who was waiting for a process to finish and started looking like a man who was watching something he had not seen before. Walter pulled the chain to the rear of the cat. He laid it out. He picked up the first link and ran his fingers along it. He turned the link in the morning light. He set it down. He picked up the second link, the third, the fourth. He did this for every link he would put under load. This was the part he had not skipped in 43 years. Not since the morning in 1944, when his father had said never again, and Walter had said never again, and the saying had become a discipline that lived in his hands without thinking. Walter had checked every link of every chain he had ever pulled with for the next 43 years. He was not going to stop checking now. He was on the 23rd link when he stopped. He held the link up to the morning sun, turned it slightly, felt the surface with his thumb. The link was 3/4-inch alloy steel, rated to 24,000 pounds working load and 48,000 pounds braking strength. There was a hairline crack along the inside curve of the link. It was not a stress fracture from previous use. It was a manufacturing defect that had probably been in the chain since the day it left the factory in 1962. Walter had run this chain through dozens of light loads over the years. The defect had grown each time. It had not been visible to a casual inspection 2 years ago. It was barely visible now. Walter turned the link in the light and found the crack, and left it and found it again. The crack was 80% of the way through the cross-section of the link. Under 30,000 pounds of load, this ink was going to fail. The break would not be a slow failure. It would be a clean snap. The released energy would propel a section of 3/4-inch chain at speeds approaching 600 feet per second. Anyone within 15 feet of the chain at the moment of failure would be at risk of catastrophic injury or death. Wendell would be at the rear of the cat, 10 feet from the chain. Roland's 2 crew members would be on the shoulder 12 feet from the chain. Garrett Hollis would be standing with Roland 15 feet from the chain. Brett Holloway would be leaning against his pickup 18 feet from the chain. Walter held the link. He felt his right hand begin to tremble. The tremble was not from the cold. The tremble was from the recognition of what would have happened if he had not checked. The recognition of what would have happened if he had been a younger man. More confident hurrying because there was an audience watching. The recognition that Brett Holloway would have been right. Not for the reason Brett thought he was right, but right anyway. The day you stop checking is the day the machine stops trusting you. Walter could hear his father's voice as clearly as if Henrik were standing 6 feet away. He held the link for a long count, felt the tremble in his hand, and waited for it to stop. It stopped. He set the link down on the flatbed. He turned to Wendell. "Bring the spare chain," Walter said. Wendell looked at him, looked at the link. did not need to be told what he was seeing. He went to the truck, brought the spare coil that Walter had loaded the night before for exactly this contingency. They worked together for the next 8 minutes, replacing the section of chain that contained the failed link. They did not speak. They did not need to. Wendell had been working alongside his father at this kind of task for 30 years. Brett Holloway did speak. "What is wrong now, old-timer?" Brett said. "Cold feet." The crew on the shoulder did not laugh. Garrett did not laugh. Roland did not laugh. Walter looked up from the chain. He looked at Brett Holloway across 30 feet of wet October morning. He did not look at him with anger. He looked at him the way a man looks at something he has seen 1,000 times before and has no more energy to be surprised by. There was something almost sad in the look. Brett's smirk faltered for half a second under it. Walter went back to his work. It took 8 more minutes to reset the chain. When he was done, he checked every link of the new section. He checked every link of the spare chain he had brought. He checked the connection points where the new section joined the existing chain. He did not skip a single link. He did not hurry. He was aware that the morning was getting on. He was aware that Brett Holloway's crane was due in 5 minutes. He worked at the same pace he had worked at all morning, the pace Henrik had taught him. When the chain was rigged and checked and rigged again, Walter walked to the Caterpillar. He climbed up to the seat, settled in, rested his hands on the steering clutch levers, looked forward across the engine, cowling at the line of chain that ran out to the snatch block and away to the trailer. He did not start the engine. He sat in the seat with his hands on the levers and his eyes open looking forward, and he did not move. The morning was quiet. The wind had died. The crew on the shoulder of the road was quiet. Even Brett Holloway was quiet. The only sound was the distant calling of a flock of geese somewhere to the north going south for the winter on a day in October that was the first cold day of the season. Walter closed his eyes. He felt the seat beneath him. He felt the levers under his hands. He felt the cold morning air on his face. He felt the weight of the years he had carried, and the weight of the years his father had carried before him, and the weight of the work Henrik had asked him to do without ever asking it directly. He felt the ground beneath the cat. He felt the way the tracks had bedded into the gravel of the road shoulder. He felt the slope of the road. He felt the tension of the chain, even though the chain was slack. He felt the truck on the other end of the rigging. He felt the suction of the clay holding the tandems. He let himself feel it all. He did not push any of it away. He did not try to organize any of it into thoughts. He let it sit in him the way a glass of water sits on a table. "What the hell is he doing?" Brett said. Wendell answered. He said it loudly enough that Walter could hear from the seat. "He is gathering," Wendell said. Brett laughed. "Gathering? Is that what we call sleeping these days?" Henrik taught him, Wendell said. The way Wendell said it stopped Brett's next sentence before it came out. There was no aggression in the way Wendell said it. It was just a statement of fact. The way a man states a fact he has lived with all his life. Walter did not have to look to know that Brett Holloway had not said anything else. Walter sat for 1 minute. He did not measure the minute. He had stopped needing to measure the minute about the 3rd time he had done this. The body knew. The body had its own clock when you let it. He opened his eyes. He looked at the chain. He looked at the trailer. He looked at the angle. He said quietly to nobody but the cat itself, "All right then." He started the engine. Have you ever stood in a room where someone with money and confidence told you in front of witnesses that you had made a terrible mistake? Where the person doing the telling was not asking you a question, was not waiting to hear. Your side was not interested in whether you were right or wrong. The person was just telling you, and the room was watching. And you had to decide in that moment whether to defend yourself or whether to let your work do the answering. Walter Bergstrom had been in a lot of those rooms in 71 years. He had learned the answer. The answer was that you let the work do the answering. The answer was that you did not waste your breath on a man who was not listening. The answer was that you set your hands on the levers, and you took your time, and you did the job right, and you let the silence afterwards say everything that needed to be said. The engine came up to operating speed. Walter let it sit at idle for 30 seconds. He listened to the rhythm. There was no skip. There was no change. The cat was the cat. He engaged the clutch. The Caterpillar moved forward at less than 1 mile per hour. The chain came off the ground in a slow rising line. The chain went from slack to taut, from taut to rigid. For a long moment, nothing else happened. The 14-inch steel cleats pressed into the gravel of the road shoulder. They did not spin. They did not slip. They pressed the way fingers press when they are gripping rope. The diesel engine note dropped from a steady, idle rhythm to something lower and deeper and more deliberate. It sounded like the cat was thinking. It sounded like a living thing, making a decision about whether what was being asked was possible, and concluding slowly, yes. But it is going to take everything I have. The chain began to hum. It was a sound that was not exactly sound. It was vibration. It moved through the air at a frequency that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Roland Delaney heard it and uncrossed his arms. One of his crew members took a step backwards. Garrett Hollis pushed himself up off the side of his pickup and stood straight. The Peterbilt did not move. The chain held. The tracks held. The clay held. Walter held the throttle steady. He did not increase. He did not decrease. He sat in the seat of a 59-year-old machine on the shoulder of County Road 14 on a Thursday morning in October of 1987, and he held the throttle exactly where his father had taught him to hold it for a load of this size. Steady, patient, without surge. 3 seconds passed. The clay around the rear tandems of the Peterbilt made a sound. It was a sound that came from below the surface of the earth. It was deep. It was wet. It was reluctant. It was the sound of something ancient being asked to release something it had decided to keep. The Peterbilt moved 1 inch, and in that moment, sitting on the seat of a machine his father had bought in 1934 for $1,850 at a Depression auction, where another family had lost everything. Walter Bergstrom felt his father standing next to him as clearly as he had felt him at the original auction, 53 years before. Felt Henrik's hand on his shoulder. Felt the words his father had said the night they had backed the cat. Into the shed for the first time. We will keep this machine running until one of us is dead, and then your son will. And by the time we are all done with it, they will have to bury it, because nothing else will stop it. The Peterbilt moved 6 inches in the first 90 seconds, then a foot, then 2 feet. The clay around the rear tandems was not letting go all at once. It was letting go in stages the way old grief lets go in pieces, and pauses, and slow tearing sounds that came up from below the road and seemed to come from somewhere older than the road itself. Walter held the throttle steady. He did not look at the truck as it moved. He looked at the chain. The chain told him what he needed to know. As long as the chain hummed at the right frequency and held the right line and showed no slack, the pull was working. If the chain went silent, something was about to break. If the chain shifted angle, the load was twisting. Walter had learned to read a chain the way a doctor reads a pulse, and he read this one now without thinking about reading it. The chain stayed steady. At 8 minutes, the front steer axle of the Peterbilt lifted clear of the clay, with a sound like a cork coming out of a glass bottle. Black mud sprayed across the ditch bank in a slow arc. The trailer shifted forward 6 inches in a single motion, and then settled, and then began to move again. At 15 minutes, the rear tandems were turning over instead of being dragged. The wheels were not driving. They were rolling. The truck was being pulled at 1 mile per hour up the gentle slope of the ditch bank toward the gravel of the road shoulder. At 28 minutes, the trailer was on the shoulder. At 41 minutes, the entire rig sat on County Road 14, all 18 wheels on solid ground. The frame rails level for the first time in 3 days, 4 flat tires and a bent mud flap, and a coating of black Iowa clay from the bottom of the doors down. At 48 minutes, Walter shut down the Caterpillar. The silence that came after the engine stopped had a weight to it that pressed against the chest of every man standing on that road. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The geese had long since flown south. The wind was still down. There was just the quiet ticking of the cooling cylinder block of the cat and the distant sound of a single crow somewhere in the cottonwoods half a mile away. Walter climbed down from the seat slowly. His right knee popped on the second step. He did not rush. He walked to the chain. He began to unhook the rigging the way he had hooked it. Methodical. The same pace. He coiled the chain in loops of about 4 feet, draping each loop over his forearm. He had done this 10,000 times. He did not stop and look at the truck. He did not stop and look at anyone. Brett Holloway watched him for 30 seconds. Then, Brett pushed off the fender of his pickup. He stood for another 10 seconds with his arms still crossed. Then he uncrossed them. He looked at the Peterbilt sitting on the road. He looked at the Caterpillar. He looked at Walter coiling chain. He did not look at Garrett Hollis, or at Roland Delaney, or at Roland's 2 crew members. He walked to the driver's door of his pickup. He opened it. He got in. He started the engine. He turned the truck around in 3 quick movements on the shoulder of the road, throwing gravel as the chrome wheels caught. He drove west on County Road 14, toward the highway that would take him back to Des Moines. He did not say a word. He did not say goodbye. He did not pay Garrett the mobilization fee that had been owed on the canceled crane. He did not look back. Walter coiled the chain. Roland Delaney walked over to him after another minute. Roland was 42 years old, and he had been in the recovery business for 15 years, and he had a face that did not show much. He stopped about 6 feet from Walter, and he stood there until Walter looked up. Mr. Bergstrom, Roland said. Yes, I have done this work for 15 years. I have not seen anything do what I just watched you do. Walter nodded once, did not stop coiling. I would like to ask you a question, if I may. Yes. How did you know about the angle? The 30-degree change. Walter set down the chain, looked at Roland for a long moment. Then he said, my father showed me in 1937. We had a hay wagon stuck in the south field. He drew it for me on the back of a feed bag with a pencil. The geometry has not changed since then. Roland nodded slowly. He did not say anything else. He went back to his crew. They began breaking down their own equipment in silence. Garrett Hollis walked over next. He stopped at about the same distance Roland had stopped at. He stood there with his hands in the pockets of his Carhartt jacket, and Walter could see, even without looking up, that Garrett's posture had changed in the last 50 minutes in a way that Garrett himself had probably not noticed yet. Mr. Bergstrom, Garrett said, "What do I owe you?" Walter looked up. "You do not owe me anything." Garrett shook his head slowly. "I owe you $30,000 at a minimum. Probably more. I had a crane coming that was going to cost me $12,000 before the lift even started. I had penalties stacking at $2,400 a day. You just saved me my company." Walter set down the chain again. He stood up straight. The cold morning air bit at his shoulder where the arthritis had been working all morning. He did not show it on his face. "I did not do this for money," Walter said. "Then why did you do it?" Walter thought about how to answer the question. He had answered it 100 times in 71 years, and he had never quite gotten the answer the way he wanted it to come out. Henrik had had a way of saying it that Walter had never been able to match. Henrik had been able to say it in 2 sentences and have it land. Walter usually needed 5, and even then it did not always land. He tried. "I had a father," Walter said, "who taught me that a thing you can do for someone else is not really yours to keep." The cat was not built for parade. It was built to do work. If I had walked past you yesterday, I would not have owned that machine. The machine would have owned me. Garrett looked at the ground. Then he looked up. His eyes were wet, but he did not let the tears come. He was a man of 38 years, who had built a company from nothing, and who had nearly watched it sink in one Tuesday morning, and who was now standing on the gravel shoulder of a county road with the man who had pulled him out of it, and the man was telling him there was no bill. "Mr. Bergstrom," Garrett said, "I would like to do something for you. I do not know what it is yet, but I would like the chance to figure it out." Walter nodded. "Took my time figuring out what my father meant," he said. "You take whatever time you need." He went back to coiling the chain. Wendell drove the flatbed home. Walter drove the cat. 4 miles per hour the entire way. The same ringing rhythm of the steel cleats. The same patient pace. By the time he reached the machine shed, it was almost noon. Eleanor had a sandwich and a bowl of soup waiting on the kitchen table. He ate it without speaking. She did not ask. He did not need to be asked. After lunch, he went back out to the shed. He spent 2 hours cleaning the cat, wiping mud off the tracks, checking every grease fitting, checking the fluid levels, walking around it the way he walked around it after every pull. He did not hurry. He had no reason to hurry. The cat had done what he had asked it to do. What was left was the part that came after every job, and was as important as the job itself. The taking care of the machine that took care of you. When he was done, he stood in the open door of the shed and looked at the cat in the afternoon light. He said nothing out loud, but in the privacy of his own head, he said 2 words to the man who had bought the machine 53 years before. "Did okay," he said, the way a son says it when he wants his father to know he has not embarrassed him. He closed the shed door. He went into the house. He sat down at the kitchen table across from Eleanor, and he took her hand, and he held it for a long time without saying anything at all. That night, Walter did not sleep 4 hours. He slept 7. He slept the way a man sleeps when something he has been carrying for a long time has been set down. Eleanor woke up once around 2 in the morning and listened to him breathing and put her hand lightly on his back and felt the slow rise and fall under her palm and went back to sleep herself. Garrett Hollis came to the Bergstrom farm 4 times over the next 8 days. The first time he brought a check for $2,000. Walter said no. The second time he brought a check for $500 made out to Walter personally. Walter said no. The third time he came with no check at all. He sat at the kitchen table with Walter and Eleanor for an hour, and he asked questions about the farm and about Henrik and about the cat. Walter answered some of them. He did not answer all of them. Eleanor poured the coffee and listened and did not say much. The fourth time was a Saturday morning. Walter was out at the machine shed. Eleanor opened the door for Garrett. Garrett asked if he could come inside for a minute. Eleanor said yes. Garrett walked into the kitchen and stood at the table and took an envelope out of his jacket pocket and laid it on the table. "It is not for him," Garrett said. "It is for the Hardin County 4-H. I made it out to them. He cannot say no to a check made out to a charity." Eleanor looked at the envelope, looked at Garrett, did not pick it up. "I will give it to him," she said. Garrett nodded. He stood there for another moment as if he wanted to say something else. He did not say it. He left. When Walter came in from the shed for lunch, Eleanor handed him the envelope. Walter opened it, looked at the check. $500. Hardin County 4-H Foundation. Garrett's signature at the bottom in blue ink. The date written in the upper right corner. October 22nd, 1987. He did not say anything. He put the check on the kitchen table, ate his lunch, drank his coffee. After lunch, he picked up the check and walked out to the machine shed and laid it on the shelf above his workbench behind the can of WD-40 and in front of the small wooden box where he kept the spare points for the magneto. He did not cash it. Eleanor came to the door of the shed an hour later. She had been thinking about the check. "Walter," she said. "Yes. Are you going to deposit it?" "Why not?" He turned to face her, stood with his hands on the workbench, looked at his wife of 49 years. "Because it is not money," he said. "It is a reminder. A reminder of what? Of why I did it." She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She turned and went back to the house. She did not bring the check up again. The check stayed on that shelf for the next 16 years. The story spread the way. Stories spread. In a county where everybody knows everybody. Garrett Hollis told it at the cooperative. Roland Delaney told it at the wrecker shop in Iowa Falls, and at his church, and at the diner in Eldora, where he had breakfast on Sundays. The 2 crew members who had been there told it to other recovery operators across 3 counties. Within a month, half of Hardin County had heard about the 71-year-old farmer who had pulled a 47,000-pound Peterbilt out of suction clay with a tractor built before most of them were born. People started calling Walter. He did not pick up most of them. Eleanor took messages. Walter looked at the messages and did not call back. He did not want to be famous. He had never wanted to be famous. He wanted to do his work and live with his wife and walk out to the machine shed on Saturday mornings, and that was the size of his ambition. 2 of the calls he did return. The first was from a man named Calvin Hartley, Charlie Hartley's youngest son. Charlie had died of a stroke in 1983. Calvin was running the Hartley place now. Calvin had a tractor stuck in a wet spot on the back 40, and he wanted to know if Walter would consider coming over to help. Walter said yes. He drove the cat over the next morning, pulled the tractor out in 20 minutes, refused the coffee Calvin offered after, drove home. The second was from a young woman who said she was a reporter for the Iowa Farmer Today. She wanted to come out and write a piece about what had happened on County Road 14. Walter said no, politely. The young woman pressed, said it would be a positive story, said it would honor what he had done. Walter said no again. The young woman asked why. Walter said because what I did was not for a newspaper. It was just work. She did not call back. Years passed. Walter farmed. Eleanor kept the house. Wendell came over for Sunday dinner with Linda and Caleb. Caleb grew. He was 4 in 1991 when Walter walked him out to the machine shed for the first time and let him sit on the seat of the cat. Caleb's feet did not reach the floorboard. He held the steering levers with both hands and made an engine noise with his mouth. Walter stood next to the machine and watched and did not speak. In the spring of 1994, Walter walked into the kitchen on a Thursday morning in March and set a wrench down on the table and looked at his hands for a long minute without speaking. Eleanor was at the stove. She heard the wrench hit the wood. She turned around. Walter looked up at her. "Time," he said. That was all he said. She knew what he meant. Henrik had said the same word in 1961, in the same kitchen at the same table when his hands had finally refused to thread a half-inch bolt. Walter was 78 years old. His hands had been getting worse for 2 years. He had been hiding it from her badly the way men hide things from women they have been married to for 56 years. Eleanor came over and sat down across from him. "What do you want to do?" she said. "Give the farm to Wendell." She nodded. "Keep the shed." She nodded. "Keep the cat." She nodded. Wendell came over that afternoon. Walter told him in the kitchen. Wendell did not say anything for a long time. He was 48 years old. He had been farming alongside his father for 30 years. He had been waiting for this conversation, and he had also not been waiting for it because no man is ever ready to be told that his father is finished. Wendell finally just stood up and walked around the table and put his hand on his father's shoulder. Did not speak. Did not need to. The transfer was made that summer. 320 acres of Hardin County prairie that Henrik had broken in 1909 passed from Walter to Wendell on a Tuesday in July of 1994. Walter signed the papers at the kitchen table. The lawyer was a man named Davis Beckman, who had handled the Bergstrom legal work since 1972. Walter signed his name and set down the pen, and that was the end of 53 years of farming his father's ground. He kept the shed. He kept the cat. Every Saturday morning for the next 9 years, he walked out to the shed and did the maintenance. The grease fittings, the fluid checks, the chain inspection. The same routine Henrik had taught him in 1934. The cat did not get used. It did not need to. It got cared for. That was what mattered. Wendell came over on those Saturdays sometimes. He would help his father with the parts of the maintenance that Walter's hands could not do anymore. They did not talk much during the work. They did not need to. The work was the conversation. It was the conversation Henrik had taught Walter, and it was the conversation Walter had taught Wendell, and it would be the conversation that Wendell would teach his own son Caleb when the time came. The years between 1994 and 2003 were quiet years for Walter and Eleanor. They did not travel. They had never traveled. Eleanor planted her vegetable garden every spring and put up tomatoes and beans and pickles every fall, the way she had since the first year of their marriage. Walter walked to the machine shed every Saturday. They went to the small Lutheran church in Eldora on Sundays. They had Wendell and Linda and Caleb over for dinner once a week. Caleb grew up calling Walter Grandpa, and not knowing yet that the old man with the stained hands was a person about whom stories were told at the cooperative when the men got together in the winter mornings to drink coffee. Walter died on a Sunday morning in February of 2003, 86 years old. He was sitting in his chair in the front room with the morning light coming through the east window. Eleanor was in the kitchen making breakfast. She had heard him cough once and then go quiet. When she walked into the front room, he was sitting exactly as she had left him, with his eyes closed and a small smile on his mouth. The morning light was on his face. The newspaper was folded in his lap. She knew before she touched him. She sat down on the footstool in front of his chair, and she took his hands in hers, and she held them for a long time before she got up and walked to the kitchen and called Wendell. The light moved across the room while she sat there. She did not cry. She had been preparing herself for that morning for 10 years, and the preparation had done its work. The crying would come later in pieces over the next 6 years, until she joined him. The morning itself was just a quiet ending to a long marriage. The funeral was on a Wednesday at First Lutheran Church in Eldora. It was the largest funeral the church had hosted in 20 years. 370 people. Farmers in suits that did not fit them well. Businessmen who had driven from Cedar Rapids and Des Moines and as far as Omaha. The Donovan family. What was left of them, 2 grandsons and a great-granddaughter, who had heard the auction story passed down through their family for 4 generations. Roland Delaney, 67, now retired in a black suit. 2 of his old crew members, the Hartley family, the Peterson family. Anders Peterson had died in 1996, but his sons came. They sat together in the 7th pew. Garrett Hollis sat in the 3rd pew. He was 54 years old. He had sold Hollis Grain Hauling to a regional carrier 2 years before. He sat alone except for his wife. He held her hand all the way through the service. Wendell gave the eulogy. He stood at the front of the church in a black suit that hung loose on him because he had lost weight in the 4 days between his father's death and the funeral. He looked at the casket for a long time before he began to speak. "My father was a patient man," Wendell said. Not the passive kind of patient, the active kind. The kind that knew some problems took time, and that spending time on them was not the same as wasting time on them. Then he told the story. The church was quiet for a long time after that.